On a gloomy day that marked the last of the school year, the students of Elmwood High were buzzing with the excitement of summer. However, one student, Mara, felt an unsettling chill as she stepped into the school building, a sense of foreboding clouding her usually cheerful demeanor. Mara's day began ordinarily, with final exams and yearbook signings, but as the hours ticked by, her anxiety grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. During lunch, she overheard a group of teachers whispering frantically in the corner of the cafeteria. The words lockdown and not a drill caught her attention, but before she could process it, the announcement came. The principal's voice cracked through the intercom, instructing all students to proceed to the nearest classroom and lock the doors. No explanation was given, only urgent commands. Mara and her classmates scrambled into their history classroom, the heavy door thudding shut behind them. As the classroom darkened and the blinds were drawn, Mara sat huddled with her classmates, listening to the eerie silence that enveloped the school. The air was thick with tension and fear. Minutes felt like hours as they waited, listening for any sign of what was happening outside. Then, they heard it, a series of soft, dragging steps in the hallway, accompanied by a strange, raspy breathing that seemed to grow louder as it neared their classroom. The teacher held a finger to her lips, signaling everyone to be silent. The steps stopped right outside their door, and a shadow loomed through the glass panel above them. The door handle jiggled slightly, then started shaking violently as if someone, or something, was trying to gain entry. The students held their breath, too afraid to move, too terrified to even whisper. The shaking stopped abruptly, and was replaced by a haunting, childlike voice singing an eerie nursery rhyme. The words were muffled, but the tune was unmistakable and chilling. Just as suddenly as it had begun, the singing stopped. The silence returned, but the fear remained, heavier than before. Mara's heart raced as she exchanged frightened glances with her classmates. They were trapped, unsure of the danger lurking on the other side of the door, their fates unknown. And then, in the silence that followed, the intercom clicked on once more. But this time, instead of the principal's voice, there was only static, and then, a whisper, barely audible, sending chills down everyone's spine, come out, wherever you are." The static on the intercom crackled ominously before cutting out completely, plunging the classroom into a tense silence once more. Mara and her classmates exchanged nervous glances, each one of them too afraid to speak or even breathe too loudly. The air felt heavier, charged with a palpable sense of dread. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the hallways, sounding like a locker slamming shut, followed by the soft, eerie melody of the nursery rhyme once again. This time, it was louder, clearer, and unmistakably coming from multiple voices. It seemed as if invisible children were slowly circling their classroom, their voices weaving in and out of each other in a haunting lullaby. The teacher, Ms. Thompson, mustered her courage and whispered to the class, "Stay quiet, stay down," as she slowly edged toward the classroom phone. She picked up the receiver, her hands trembling, and dialed the main office, but all she heard was static. The lines were dead. Meanwhile, Mara, who was seated near the window, peeked through a small gap in the blinds. The schoolyard was deserted, the overcast sky casting a dreary shadow over the empty playground. But then, something caught her eye, a figure standing by the school's entrance, dressed in an old-fashioned school uniform, barely discernible in the dim light. The figure stood still, watching, waiting. Mara pulled back quickly, her heart pounding. She whispered to the person next to her, "There's someone outside." The classroom door rattled again, more insistently this time. The strange childlike singing continued, now accompanied by a soft tapping on the glass. "Let us in, let us in, let us in," the voices sang, over and over, in a hypnotic rhythm. Ms. Thompson backed away from the phone, her eyes wide with fear. "We have to block the door," she said in a hushed tone. The students scrambled, pushing desks and chairs against the door, fortifying their makeshift barricade with shaking hands. As they worked, the lights in the classroom flickered and then went out completely, enveloping them in darkness. The only light now came from the stormy sky outside, casting eerie shadows across the room. The tapping on the glass grew louder, more desperate. Suddenly, a loud crack shattered the silence as the glass in the door's window pane cracked. A cold wind blew through the small opening, carrying with it the chilling laughter of children. The intercom buzzed to life again, this time louder than before. The static cleared, and a deep, distorted voice boomed through the speakers, "Time to play." The voice was followed by a loud, mechanical whirring sound, like that of an old film projector starting up. In the dark, the outlines of figures appeared projected on the walls of the classroom, shadowy silhouettes of children, their movements jerky and unnatural as they played an eerie game of Ring Around the Rosie. Mara felt a cold draft as the temperature in the room dropped, her breath visible in the air. She clutched her arms around herself, feeling the eyes of the shadowy children on her, hearing their whispers creeping into her mind, "Join us, join us, join us." The fear was palpable, the threat imminent, and their escape uncertain. What lay beyond the classroom was unknown, but inside, the terror was all too real. The oppressive cold continued to seep into the classroom, the shadows on the walls twirling faster as the ghostly children's game grew more frenzied. Mara's eyes darted around the room, catching glimpses of her classmates, their faces illuminated intermittently by the flickering of the overhead light that struggled against the encroaching darkness. Ms. Thompson's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding despite her visible fear. "Everyone, get to the corner, away from the windows and door," she instructed. As the class huddled together, the room felt smaller, the walls closing in as the spectral laughter of the children echoed around them. Suddenly, a loud crash resonated through the school, silencing the laughter and momentarily pausing the shadow play on the walls. The eerie silence that followed was broken by heavy, uneven footsteps approaching the classroom. The barricade against the door shuddered as something slammed against it from the outside. Mara held her breath, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles turned white. Without warning, the projector-like images flickered and shifted, transforming the playful shadows into a grotesque parade of distorted figures, their limbs elongated and faces twisted in expressions of pain and malice. The figures seemed to reach out towards the children, their fingers almost piercing the very air of reality. In the corner of the room, one of Mara's classmates, Ethan, began whispering fervently to himself, his eyes unfocused, as if he could see something that others couldn't. "They want us to follow them," he murmured, his voice gaining an unsettling certainty. "They want us to play their game, forever." Ms. Thompson tried to comfort him, but Ethan suddenly stood up, moving towards the door with a strange determination. Mara reached out, grabbing his arm in a futile attempt to hold him back. "Ethan, no! It's not safe," she pleaded. Ignoring her, Ethan pressed his face against the small cracked window of the door, peering out. The temperature dropped further, frost forming on the inside of the glass as his breath fogged it up. His voice was a mere whisper, yet everyone heard him clearly, "They're here." The power surged back, flooding the classroom with harsh fluorescent light, casting stark shadows behind each desk and chair. The abrupt light revealed that the figures projected on the walls were no longer just harmless shadows, they had depth and appeared almost solid, turning towards the huddled students with a menacing intent. Before anyone could react, the door burst open, sending desks and chairs skittering across the floor. A gust of freezing wind rushed in, carrying with it leaves and twigs as though it had traveled through the forest. Standing in the doorway was not a person or creature, but a dense, dark fog that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It hovered momentarily, then slowly rolled into the room, enveloping everything in its path. The children screamed, scrambling away from the advancing fog, but it moved unnaturally, splitting and twisting to corner them. Ms. Thompson grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall, aiming it at the fog, but as she discharged it, the mist seemed to swallow the cloud of chemicals, unharmed and undeterred. Mara's heart pounded in her ears as she backed into the far corner of the room with her remaining classmates. The cold was biting now, numbing her fingers and toes. The fog continued to advance, and as it touched the first of her classmates, he let out a scream that was abruptly silenced, his figure becoming a shadow within the mist. As the fog drew nearer, Mara looked around desperately for any form of escape or defense. Her eyes landed on the old ventilation grate above the storeroom door. It was small and high, but it might be their only chance. The vent, she yelled over the din of terrified cries, pointing towards it. "We need to get up there." With no time to lose, the students frantically stacked chairs and desks beneath the ventilation grate. The mist swirled closer, its tendrils creeping along the floor, curling around the furniture, and stretching towards the terrified students. Mara boosted her classmate, Lucas, up first, urging him to pry open the grate quickly. His fingers fumbled with the screws, his movements hastened by the chilling screams of another classmate enveloped by the fog. The grate clanged loudly as it hit the floor, and Lucas scrambled up into the dark shaft, turning to help the others. Mara directed the younger students to go next, her heart pounding as she watched the fog roll closer, its form now swirling menacingly, almost with purpose. Ms. Thompson assisted the students, lifting them as they climbed, her face set with a grim determination. As Mara prepared to climb, she glanced back at Ethan, who stood still by the window, his expression distant, as if mesmerized by the chaos. "Ethan, come on," she yelled, reaching at her hand. But he shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving the fog. "It's too late for me, go," he murmured, his voice a resigned whisper. Reluctantly, Mara turned and hoisted herself into the vent, feeling the cold metal against her skin. Behind her, the room was fading into a dense white as the fog filled every corner, obscuring her view. She could hear Ms. Thompson urging Ethan one last time before a final, resigned silence fell over the room. Inside the ventilation shaft, the air was stale, and the space was cramped. Lucas led the way, the beam from his cell phone light cutting through the darkness. The metal ducts rattled under their weight, echoing their movements through the empty school. The group crawled through the labyrinthine network of ducts, the sound of their own breathing loud in the confined space. Every turn and junction brought them further from the classroom but offered no hint of safety or escape. Mara's mind raced with fear for those left behind and worry about what they would find at the end of this desperate escape route. Suddenly, a sharp noise pierced the silence, a metallic scraping sound followed by a thud. The students froze. The noise came again, closer this time, as if something, or someone, was navigating the ductwork behind them. Lucas whispered back, "We need to keep moving. Whatever it is, it's following us." The urgency in his voice spurred them on, pushing through the fear that clutched at their hearts. They emerged from the ventilation shaft into the dimly lit library, dust motes floating in the air disturbed by their sudden entrance. The room was silent, the only sound the distant thunder of what might have been footsteps or perhaps the echoes of their own past movements. As they gathered in the shadows of the bookshelves, Mara peered out into the hallway through the library doors. The hall was shrouded in darkness, the only light a flickering fluorescent bulb at the far end. The school seemed deserted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Deciding they couldn't stay hidden forever, Mara led the group toward the main entrance, each step tentative, listening for any sign of the strange occurrences they had fled from. As they approached the front doors, a cold wind swept through the broken panes, the night air smelling of rain and earth. Just as they reached for the doors, a chilling sound stopped them, soft, almost inaudible at first, the same eerie nursery rhyme they had heard before, now whispering through the corridors. The realization hit them with numbing fear, the nightmare was far from over. Hesitating at the main entrance, Mara and the remaining students paused as the haunting melody weaved through the air, its origins unclear but unmistakably closer than before. The melody seemed to emanate from all around them, enveloping the school in its spectral grip. Lucas, his face pale under the flickering lights, whispered urgently, "We can't go out that way. It's like it's everywhere outside." He pointed to the rear exit that led towards the school's gymnasium, suggesting a less direct, hopefully safer route to the outside. The group, their nerves frayed, silently agreed, turning away from the whispering darkness at the front doors and making their way down the hallway towards the gym. Their footsteps echoed in the empty corridors, the sound unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. As they neared the gym, the familiar cold draft greeted them, and with it, a subtle shift in the air pressure. Mara felt her ears pop slightly, a sign that the atmospheric changes were not just limited to temperature. The door to the gym creaked as they pushed it open, revealing the vast, shadow-filled space. Inside, the gym seemed transformed. The bleachers were pushed back against the walls, and the overhead lights were shattered, glass glittering like stars against the dark floor. The moonlight streaming through the high windows cast long, reaching shadows, creating the illusion of movement in the corners of the room. The nursery rhyme grew louder, now clearly echoing within the gym's walls. The students froze, scanning the dark corners and the high ceilings for any sign of movement. Suddenly, the shadows shifted, elongating and twisting into humanoid figures that began to slowly descend the walls, their movements unnatural, as if not bound by the laws of physics. Mara grabbed a discarded basketball pole, wielding it like a staff. "Stay close," she instructed, her voice a low whisper, betraying a mix of fear and determination. The group formed a tight circle in the center of the gym, their backs to each other, watching as the shadowy figures approached, creeping closer with every pulse of the haunting melody. Just then, a loud crash echoed through the gym as one of the side doors burst open, wind and rain pouring in. The sudden disturbance seemed to momentarily confuse the shadowy figures, their forms flickering uncertainly. Seizing the opportunity, Mara shouted, "Run to the door! Now!" The students sprinted towards the open door, the cold rain slapping against their faces as they burst out into the stormy night. The schoolyard was a blur of rain and darkness, the storm having transformed the familiar landscape into an almost unrecognizable terrain of mud and swirling leaves. They ran across the school field, slipping and sliding in the mud, driven by the primal urge to escape. Behind them, the shadows did not follow into the rain, instead, they lingered at the edge of the building, as if bound to the structure itself. Reaching the edge of the school property, the group found themselves at the old service road that wound its way through the woods surrounding the school. The path home was fraught with new dangers, the woods known for their dense undergrowth and the occasional creek that swelled dangerously during storms. Mara led the way, her makeshift staff held ready, her mind racing with plans and contingencies. As they entered the tree line, the wind howled through the branches, the trees bending as if in pain. The storm obscured their vision, but the path forward was their only option. In the darkness of the woods, the rain muffled all sounds, leaving them in a bubble of eerie silence. But then, a faint sound cut through the noise of the storm, a laugh, high and chilling, it seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The realization dawned on Mara and the others, the horror of Elmwood High was not confined to the school. It had followed them into the woods, into the storm, continuing their nightmarish last day of school beyond the walls that once promised safety. As Mara and the group ventured deeper into the woods, the storm above them raged with increasing ferocity, the trees bending unnaturally as if tormented by unseen forces. The laughter that had followed them out of the school was now joined by whispers, the words indistinguishable but saturated with malice. Pushing forward, the students' fear was palpable, each shadow and noise causing them to jump. The path, muddy and treacherous underfoot, sloped downward, leading them to an old bridge that crossed a swollen creek. The wood creaked ominously as they stepped onto it, the rushing water below barely visible through the storm. As they reached the midpoint of the bridge, the laughter ceased abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that was somehow more terrifying. The rain seemed to pause, the air still, and in that moment of eerie calm, a figure appeared before them on the bridge. It was Ethan, or what remained of him, his eyes hollow, his skin pale and damp. "Ethan?" Mara called out hesitantly, her heart sinking. The figure smiled, a twisted, painful smile. "You can't escape," he whispered, his voice echoing unnaturally over the water. "It wants to play forever, with all of you." Realizing escape was no longer an option, Mara tightened her grip on the staff. "We won't play its game," she declared, her voice resolute despite the trembling fear. The other students rallied behind her, their own fears momentarily stilled by her courage. Ethan's form flickered, like a bad television signal, before stabilizing. "Then it will come for you, again and again, in dreams and in waking, until you have no will left." "We'll find a way to stop it," Mara responded, stepping forward. She swung the staff with all her might, connecting with the apparition. Ethan's figure dissipated like mist, a scream echoing in the air as the storm resumed its fury. The group hurried across the bridge, reaching the other side as the structure groaned and collapsed into the creek, swept away by the raging water. Behind them, the woods seemed to scream in anger, the darkness deepening. They continued running until the woods began to thin, the first rays of dawn piercing the darkness. As they emerged from the tree line, the school and the horrors within felt like a distant nightmare. But the relief was short-lived as they realized they were standing in front of an old, abandoned building, the original Elmwood High, shuttered and forgotten decades ago. Mara felt a chill as she realized the horror might have roots deeper than they could have imagined, tied not just to the place but to the very spirit of Elmwood itself. They had escaped the immediate danger, but the true battle to sever the terror's ties to their lives was just beginning. Determined, Mara turned to her weary but alive friends. "We need to find out why it's attached to us, and how to end it for good. This is only the beginning." As they walked away from the dilapidated school, the sun rose fully, casting long shadows that seemed to whisper of dark secrets waiting to be uncovered. Mara knew their fight was far from over, but she also knew they had something no malevolent spirit could take away: hope in each other. And with that, they stepped forward, ready to face whatever lay ahead, bound by their shared ordeal and the resolve to protect their future from the horrors of the past. Warbeck had once been the pinnacle of luxury and elegance. However, time and neglect had weathered its grandeur, leaving behind a haunting shell that was more whispered about than visited. Mia Roberts, a budding YouTuber with a penchant for the paranormal, had stumbled upon the Warbeck Hotel while researching her next video series on real haunted places. The hotel's history was marred by numerous disappearances, unexplained phenomena, and chilling guest accounts, making it the perfect subject for her channel. Eager for a breakthrough in her career, Mia decided to stay at the hotel for a week to capture any paranormal activity. Upon arrival, the Warbeck Hotel loomed ominously against the gray sky. Its Gothic architecture, with pointed arches and towering spires, cast long, dark shadows across the overgrown courtyard. The interior was no less daunting. Grand staircases wound upwards into obscurity, and portraits of long-gone owners stared down from the walls with disconcerting intensity. Mia was greeted by the caretaker, an elderly man named Mr. Hawthorne, who had been looking after the hotel since anyone could remember. With a voice as creaky as the floorboards, he warned Mia of the hotel's rules: no wandering after midnight, always keep your room door locked, and never look into the mirror in the downstairs bathroom after sundown. Thanking Mr. Hawthorne, Mia set up her equipment in room 207, where most paranormal activities had been reported. Her setup included night vision cameras, EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, recorders, and a handheld thermal camera. As night fell, Mia began her exploration. The first few nights were relatively uneventful. However, her equipment occasionally picked up inexplicable cold spots and low whispers that seemed to have no discernible source. She reviewed the footage and audio recordings daily, feeling a mix of excitement and dread. On the fourth night, things took a sinister turn. Mia woke up to the chilling sensation of being watched. Her room was ice cold. Grabbing her thermal camera, she scanned the room. The camera's screen showed an abnormal cold figure standing at the foot of her bed. She whipped around, but there was nothing there. When she looked back at the camera, the figure had vanished. The next day, Mia interviewed Mr. Hawthorne, hoping to learn more about the hotel's eerie history. He spoke of a guest in the late 1920s, a young woman named Eliza, who had checked into room 207 and was never seen again. Her belongings remained untouched, and her room was left exactly as she had left it for decades. Intrigued and slightly horrified, Mia decided to spend her last night in Eliza's room. As she prepared her cameras and recorders, the air grew inexplicably cold, and a sense of unease settled over her. That night, as Mia lay in bed, the temperature dropped sharply. The EVP recorder started to crackle, and a soft, sorrowful voice echoed through the room, "Find me." Overwhelmed by fear but driven by her desire to uncover the truth, Mia followed the voice that led her to the mirror in her room. The reflection was not her own. Instead, it showed Eliza, looking pale and distraught, mouthing words Mia couldn't hear. As Mia leaned in closer, trying to understand, the mirror began to crack, the room shook, and the lights flickered violently. Suddenly, everything went dark. The camera's night vision mode showed Mia reaching towards the mirror, her hand trembling. And just as her fingers touched the glass, the video feed went abruptly static. As Mia's fingers grazed the cold, fractured surface of the mirror, the air around her hummed with a palpable, eerie energy. The mirror's reflection twisted, and Eliza's sorrowful eyes bore into Mia's soul. Suddenly, a violent gust of wind erupted in the room, sending papers flying and extinguishing the candles that Mia had lit for ambience. The only light now came from the flickering screen of Mia's camera, casting eerie shadows against the walls. The temperature in the room dropped further, a chilling embrace that seemed to seep into Mia's bones. The voice, now clearer, repeated, "Find me, free me." The words were almost a whisper, yet they filled the room with a desperate, sorrowful plea. Driven by a mixture of fear and determination, Mia asked aloud, "How can I free you, Eliza?" The air stilled for a moment before a soft, almost imperceptible whisper guided her, "The diary." In the library, Mia, though terrified, felt a surge of resolve. She needed to find the diary. Whatever secrets it held, it seemed crucial to understanding the hotel's hauntings and perhaps freeing Eliza's spirit. Grabbing her camera and the EVP recorder, she hurried out of the room. The hotel's corridors were dimly lit by the moonlight streaming through dusty windows, the silence punctuated only by her footsteps echoing off the walls. As she made her way to the ground floor, the portraits on the walls seemed to watch her, their eyes following her every move. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the hotel itself was aware of her intentions. Reaching the library, Mia pushed open the heavy wooden door. The room was shrouded in darkness, save for the moonlight that cast long, creeping shadows among the rows of ancient books. She felt a chill run down her spine as the scent of old paper and mildew hit her. The library seemed untouched by time, a relic of the hotel's grander days. Using her camera's light, Mia began searching the shelves for any sign of a diary. As she moved deeper into the library, she heard a soft thud behind her. Whirling around, her light fell upon a small, leather-bound book on the floor. It hadn't been there a moment ago. Cautiously, Mia picked it up. The cover was dusty, but the name Eliza was engraved in faded gold letters. Opening the diary, Mia began to read, her voice barely a whisper. The entries were dated back to the 1920s, detailing Eliza's stay at the Warbeck Hotel. As she read, a picture of Eliza's life and her mysterious disappearance began to unfold. Eliza wrote of strange occurrences, of feeling watched, and of eerie voices in the night. Her last entry was frantic, a desperate note that spoke of a terrible revelation and a warning to future readers. Suddenly, a cold hand seemed to clasp Mia's shoulder. She spun around, dropping the diary, her heart racing. But there was nothing there, only the lingering touch of something unseen. Panic set in, and Mia felt an overwhelming urge to flee. But she couldn't leave, not without helping Eliza. Gathering her courage, Mia picked up the diary and read the last few lines of Eliza's final entry. It mentioned a hidden room, a place where the truth of the Warbeck Hotel lay buried. Eliza's final words were a plea to uncover the secret, to bring to light what had been hidden in the shadows for too long. Determined to uncover the truth, Mia set out to find the hidden room. The hotel seemed to groan under the weight of its secrets as she moved through the darkened halls. Her path was unclear, but she felt an unseen force guiding her, leading her deeper into the bowels of the hotel. As Mia descended into the lower levels of the hotel, the air grew colder, and the oppressive feeling of dread increased. She could feel the eyes of the hotel's long-dead inhabitants watching her, the weight of their gazes almost physical in the oppressive darkness. Her camera's battery was low, the light flickering erratically as she came to a halt in front of an old, rusted door. It was concealed behind a draping tapestry, easy to miss unless one knew what to look for. This had to be it, the hidden room Eliza had written about. With trembling hands, Mia reached out to open the door, the metal cold and unyielding under her touch. As the door creaked open, a rush of stale air greeted her, carrying with it the faint, almost forgotten scent of lavender and something darker, metallic and sinister. Inside, the room was shrouded in shadow, a forgotten chamber untouched by the passage of decades. Mia's camera light pierced the darkness, revealing a room cluttered with old furniture covered in dust sheets, and walls lined with old, peeling wallpaper that seemed to whisper of bygone eras. The air was thick, laden with the musty smell of mold and decay. Mia stepped into the room, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that carpeted the floor. As she moved her light across the room, something caught her eye, a large, ornate mirror, much like the one in her room, but this one was draped in a heavy black cloth. A shiver ran down her spine as she remembered Mr. Hawthorne's warning about mirrors after sundown. But the sun had long set, and the need to uncover the truth urged her forward. With a deep breath, she reached out and pulled the cloth from the mirror. The glass was clouded with age, but as Mia stared into it, her reflection began to distort, her features twisting into a visage of horror that was not her own. She stumbled back, her heart pounding, as the air around her grew oppressively cold. Suddenly, the room filled with the sound of a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, echoing through the silent hotel. Mia's own heart raced in response, her breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. The EVP recorder crackled to life, a voice whispering from the static, "Closer, closer, find the truth." Compelled by an unseen force, Mia approached an old wooden desk in the corner of the room. The drawers were locked, but lying atop the desk was an old, yellowed photograph of a woman, Eliza. Her expression was somber, her eyes seeming to follow Mia as she moved. Next to the photograph was a small, rusty key. Mia picked up the key, the metal cold against her skin. It seemed to vibrate with an energy of its own, as if eager to unlock secrets long buried. She tried the key in the desk drawers. The first few didn't budge, but the last drawer opened with a creak that echoed ominously through the room. Inside, there were several old documents and another diary, far older than the one belonging to Eliza. As she flipped through the pages, a folded piece of paper fell out. It was a letter, written in a hurried scrawl. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. It was dated several years before Eliza's stay, written by a previous guest of the hotel. The letter spoke of dark rituals and hidden passages, of sacrifices made in the dead of night to appease something ancient and malevolent that resided within the hotel's walls. Mia's hands trembled as she read, the implications horrifying. The letter ended abruptly, the last words smeared as if the writer had been interrupted. "They are coming. They must not find me here." The truth must be, the rest was indecipherable, lost to time and fear. The heartbeat sound grew louder, more insistent. Mia felt a gust of wind as though the room itself were breathing. The temperature plummeted, her breath visible in the icy air. She turned back to the mirror, and in the reflection, she no longer saw herself but a multitude of faces, all distorted with pain and fear. They were the lost souls of the hotel, trapped within its walls. Among the faces, Eliza's stood out, her expression one of deep sorrow and pleading. Mia reached out to the mirror, her fingers nearly touching the cold glass, when suddenly the room shook violently. Books fell from the shelves, the light from her camera flickered wildly, and a deep, dark laugh echoed around her, filling the space with dread. The mirror cracked, the spiderweb lines obscuring the tortured faces as they seemed to scream silently. Mia stepped back, her mind racing. She needed to understand how to free these souls, how to put an end to the darkness that held the Warbeck Hotel in its grip. But as she turned to leave, the door through which she had entered slammed shut with a force that shook the room. The laughter grew louder, surrounding her, a sound with no discernible source but everywhere at once. Mia was trapped, the key to the mystery within her grasp, but the danger far from over. She turned back to the broken mirror, determined to confront whatever horror awaited. The shadows in the corners of the room grew darker, and the temperature dropped even further, a supernatural chill that threatened to freeze the very marrow in her bones. Mia steadied her camera, the record light blinking red in the gloom, her voice steady as she spoke into the darkness, "I am not leaving until I find the truth." The room fell silent, waiting, watching, as Mia prepared to delve deeper into the secrets of the Warbeck Hotel, her every move watched by unseen eyes. The story of the hotel was far from over, and Mia was now a part of its haunted legacy. Mia's resolve hardened as she faced the broken mirror, its jagged shards reflecting her distorted, determined image. Behind her, the laughter had ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. The cold was now almost unbearable, seeping into her bones, but Mia's focus was unyielding. She turned her attention back to the documents she had found, desperate for any clue that might help her unravel the dark mysteries of the Warbeck Hotel. Amid the papers, Mia discovered an old map of the hotel, its edges brittle and yellowed with age. The map detailed not just the guest rooms and public areas, but also marked several hidden passages and rooms that were not part of the official blueprints. One passage, in particular, caught Mia's eye. It seemed to lead from the library, where she currently was, to what the map labeled as the ritual chamber. With the map in hand, Mia scanned the library for any sign of a hidden door. The bookshelves were extensive, filled with old, leather-bound books that smelled of mildew and decay. She pushed against the shelves, feeling for any movement. Finally, one of the shelves gave way slightly, revealing a mechanism hidden behind the spines of the books. Mia pressed it, and with a low groan, the shelf swung open, revealing a narrow, dark passage. Switching on her camera's light once more, Mia stepped into the passage. The air was cooler here, if that was possible, and carried a faint, unidentifiable odor that made Mia's stomach churn. The passage was lined with stone and sloped downward, leading her deep beneath the hotel. As she walked, the silence was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat, a stark contrast to the earlier cacophony. The passage ended at an ornate door, carved with symbols that Mia didn't recognize but felt intuitively were of a dark and malevolent nature. She hesitated, her hand poised on the cold metal doorknob. The fear was palpable, a living thing that seemed to pulse in the air around her. But Mia's desire to uncover the truth, to help the trapped souls and perhaps save herself, pushed her forward. She opened the door. The room beyond was vast, much larger than she expected. The walls were lined with more symbols, some painted, some carved deeply into the stone. In the center of the room stood an altar, and though it was clear no one had used this room for many decades, the altar was disturbingly well preserved. Candles, their wax long since hardened and discolored, flanked an old book that lay open. Mia approached, her steps echoing ominously in the chamber. The book was written in a language she didn't understand, filled with more of the strange symbols from the walls. However, the drawings that accompanied the text were clear enough, they depicted rituals, some seemingly benign, others unmistakably sinister, involving figures that did not look quite human. A sudden noise, a whisper, almost too faint to hear, caused Mia to whirl around. The room remained empty, though the feeling of being watched intensified. Swallowing her fear, Mia turned back to the altar, determined to find something, anything, that could help her make sense of what was happening. That's when she noticed that the floor around the altar was slightly raised. Curious, she knelt down and felt along the edges, finding a small gap. With effort, she lifted the false floor, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside was another book, much older and bound in what looked disturbingly like human skin. Mia hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to leave it untouched, but the cries of the tormented souls echoed in her mind, driving her forward. She opened the book to the first page, and the air around her grew oppressively heavy, the darkness seeming to close in. The words on the page began to glow faintly with an unnatural light, illuminating the room with a ghastly pallor. The text was a diary, and the first entry was dated over a century ago. It told the story of the hotel's construction and the discovery of an ancient burial ground beneath the site. The entries detailed how the hotel's founder, driven by greed and a morbid fascination with the occult, had used the burial ground's dark energies to curse the hotel, binding the spirits of the dead to him for eternal servitude. As Mia read, the voices of the hotel's lost souls whispered around her, their words a mosaic of sadness and rage. She realized that she was not just in a hotel, she was in a prison of spirits, trapped by a century-old curse. Determined to free them and herself, Mia read on, searching for any mention of how to break the curse. The diary spoke of a final ritual, one that could either seal the curse forever or shatter it, but the details were maddeningly vague. Suddenly, the ground beneath Mia began to tremble, a low rumble that grew into a roar as the walls of the ritual chamber shuddered with the force of an unseen storm. Dust and small pebbles rained down from the ceiling, and the candles around the room flickered wildly as if caught in an unfelt wind. The air turned icy cold, and Mia's breath clouded in front of her face. The whispers of the trapped souls grew louder, a cacophony of desperate, anguished pleas. As Mia clutched the ancient diary to her chest, the pages fluttered as if caught in a breeze, stopping on a page marked heavily with dark, ominous symbols. Her eyes scanned the text, which spoke of a blood moon night, a rare celestial event that occurred once every century. It was on such a night, the diary revealed, that the curse had been cast, and it was only on such a night that it could be undone. Mia's heart sank as she realized the gravity of her situation. The blood moon was tonight, as she remembered seeing the crimson hue of the moon through the hotel's dusty windows earlier that evening. The alignment of such a night with her stay couldn't be a mere coincidence. It felt orchestrated, as if the hotel itself had summoned her here to witness or perhaps to partake in something unimaginable. She read on, discovering that the ritual required the presence of a bearer, a living soul who willingly offered themselves to stand in the threshold between the living and the dead. This person would need to recite a chant, written in the diary, at the peak of the blood moon. However, the text warned that if the ritual were performed incorrectly, the consequences would be dire, not only cementing the curse but strengthening it, potentially unleashing the bound spirit's wrath upon the world. The sound of the door to the ritual chamber slamming shut snapped Mia back to the present. Her heart raced as she looked up to see shadows moving along the walls, shapes that were human-like but twisted and contorted. The whispers grew into moans, and the cold pressed in around her like a physical force. Gathering her courage, Mia stood up, clutching the diary. She approached the altar, her every step echoed in the chamber. The air around her seemed to thrum with energy as the moon's red light began to seep into the room through small, dirt-caked windows high up on the walls. The symbols on the floor around the altar glowed faintly red, reflecting the moon's light. Mia placed the diary on the altar, her fingers trembling as she opened it to the page detailing the chant. She took a deep breath, her mind racing with doubts and fears. Was she truly prepared to risk everything to potentially save these tortured souls? Could she bear the immense responsibility of breaking a century-old curse? As she contemplated her next move, the room seemed to close in around her. The shadows on the walls danced more frenetically, as if excited by the prospect of what was to come. The temperature dropped further, and Mia could see her breath puff out in frantic clouds. The moans of the spirits grew louder, more urgent. Mia turned to face the mirror again, the broken glass reflecting her image back in a fractured, disjointed mosaic. She could see the fear in her own eyes, but also resolve. She had come too far to back down now. With the diary's chant in front of her, she began to read aloud, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. As she spoke the ancient words, the air in the room shifted, the wind howling through the chamber like the cries of 1,000 lost souls. The ground shook, and the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The spirits' moans turned into screams, a terrifying orchestra that filled the space with dread. Mia continued, her voice growing louder over the tumult. The symbols on the floor blazed brightly, casting eerie shadows that twisted and writhed on the walls. The energy in the room peaked as the blood moon reached its zenith, bathing everything in a deep, sinister red. Just as Mia was about to recite the final line of the chant, a deafening crash echoed through the chamber. She whirled around to see the door had flown open, revealing the figure of Mr. Hawthorne, his eyes wide with terror. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice barely audible over the storm of spiritual energy. "You don't understand what you're..." But before he could finish, a powerful force swept through the room, cutting him off and throwing Mia against the altar. The diary flew from her hands, landing open on the ground, its pages fluttering wildly as if caught in a hurricane. Lying on the floor, Mia felt the energy surge around her, the spirit's screams reaching a fever pitch. The ritual was almost complete, but now it hung in the balance, its outcome uncertain. As she struggled to regain her footing, the entire room seemed to pulse with an overwhelming power. The symbols on the floor now blazed with an intense light, casting grotesque shadows against the crumbling walls. The air was thick with the cries of the spirits, their voices mingling in a cacophonous symphony of pain and anger. Above the chaos, the blood moon cast a sinister glow through the windows, its light seeming to fuel the ritual's terrifying climax. Mia crawled toward the diary, her hands shaking as she reached out to grasp it. The room spun around her, the force of the ritual pulling at her very soul. She could feel the boundaries between the living and the dead thinning, a thin veil that threatened to tear at any moment. As she clutched the diary, her fingers found the last page of the chant. With a desperate strength, she pulled herself up, leaning against the altar for support. With the room trembling around her, Mia read the final words of the chant aloud. The moment the last syllable left her lips, an unearthly silence fell over the chamber. The howling wind ceased, the candles flickered out, and the glowing symbols dimmed to a faint shimmer. The oppressive presence of the spirits paused as if holding its breath, and the air filled with a palpable tension. Mia stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, waiting for a sign of what she had unleashed. The mirror, cracked and ominous, suddenly cleared, reflecting nothing but an empty room behind her. She turned slowly, her heart pounding, expecting to face some horrific manifestation of the curse she had dared to confront. But the room was empty. The shadows retreated, clinging to the corners like specters of a nightmare fading at dawn. The sense of overwhelming dread lifted, leaving a heavy stillness in its wake. Confused but relieved, Mia stepped toward the door, her movements hesitant. As she passed the mirror, she glanced at it once more. This time, her own reflection stared back, unaltered but for the pale visage of fatigue and fear. Mia exited the ritual chamber, her steps echoing in the empty corridors of the Warbeck Hotel. The hotel itself seemed to have exhaled a long-held breath, the atmosphere lighter, though still heavy with the echoes of its dark past. She made her way back to the library, the path now familiar and less foreboding. As she reached the main hall, Mr. Hawthorne appeared from the shadows, his expression a mix of awe and fear. "Is it over?" he asked, his voice trembling. I think so, Mia replied, unsure of the consequences of her actions. The spirits, the voices, they're gone. Mr. Hawthorne nodded, looking around as if seeing the hotel for the first time. You've done something no one else has dared to, he said softly. But remember, some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. Mia pondered his words, a chill running down her spine. She had set out to uncover the truth, to document her findings for her audience. But in doing so, she had become part of the hotel's haunting legacy. As she gathered her equipment, preparing to leave, she felt the weight of Mr. Hawthorne's warning. The Warbeck Hotel stood silent as Mia walked out into the early morning light. The curse might have been broken, or perhaps it had merely changed, transformed by her actions into something new, something unknown. As she drove away, the hotel shrank in her rearview mirror, but the sense of unease remained. Mia knew her experience at the Warbeck Hotel was far from over. The footage she had captured, the events she had witnessed, and the shadows that still lingered in her mind were just the beginning. The true horror might not have been the spirits or the curse, but the realization that some mysteries are better left unexplored. As the road stretched out before her, Mia felt the pull of the hotel, a gnawing sense that she would return. The story was incomplete, its chapters written in the whispers of the dead and the silence of the unseen. And somewhere, in the depths of the Warbeck Hotel, the shadows waited, patient and eternal, for her return. It was supposed to be a day of celebration and relief, the final bell ringing not just to signify the end of the day, but the end of another school year at Hawthorne High. However, as the first light of dawn crept through the curtains of classroom 12B, a peculiar sense of dread settled over the room. The usually boisterous hallways were silent, unnervingly so. Jenny, a senior, was the first to notice something amiss when she arrived early to help decorate the halls for the final assembly. As she strung banners across the lockers, the fluorescent lights flickered, casting strange shadows that seemed to dance in the corners of her eyes. Dismissing it as a trick of the light, she continued her task, unaware of the eyes watching her from the end of the hallway. By the time other students began to arrive, a thick fog had enveloped the school grounds, obscuring the view outside and muffling sounds. Inside, students spoke in hushed tones, a collective unease growing among them. Even the teachers seemed wary, their smiles tight and forced as they ushered students into their classrooms. During what was supposed to be a joyful final assembly in the gym, the power went out, plunging the room into darkness. Screams echoed as the emergency lights struggled to pierce the blackness. When the lights flickered back on, a student from the back row was missing. His friends claimed he had gone to the bathroom moments before the blackout, but he was nowhere to be found. The principal tried to calm the panicked students, assuring them it was just a power surge and that the missing student had probably returned to class. However, the atmosphere had shifted, the day of celebration had turned somber. Classes resumed, but the feeling of dread hung heavy in the air. As the final bell rang, instead of the usual cheers, there was a hurried silence as students quickly packed their bags. Jenny, feeling uneasy, decided to check the bathrooms for the missing student one last time. As she neared the bathroom, the lights in the hallway dimmed, and she heard what sounded like whispering coming from inside. Pushing the door open slowly, the whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a cold gust of air that made her shiver. Stepping inside, Jenny called out, but there was no response. The bathroom seemed empty, yet a stall door was slightly ajar. As she approached to push it open, the lights flickered violently, and the door slammed shut on its own. Jenny stumbled back, her heart racing, as she heard the whispering start again, louder this time, surrounding her, coming from nowhere and everywhere. Terrified, she turned to run, but as she did, the floor beneath her began to tremble. The walls of the bathroom cracked, tiles falling like rain, and a deep, dark hole appeared where the stall once stood. The whispering turned into a chorus of eerie voices calling her name, beckoning her to come closer. Jenny's scream echoed through the empty school as she stood on the brink, staring into the abyss that had opened in the heart of Hawthorne High. As Jenny stood paralyzed, staring into the gaping void, the school trembled again, more violently this time. Plaster dust rained down, and the voices grew louder, their tone urgent. Despite her terror, a strange compulsion urged her forward. Deep within, she felt an inexplicable pull towards the darkness. Back in the gym, the students were slowly leaving, discussing in low tones the bizarre events of the day. The missing student was now a topic of whispered rumors and wild conjectures. Amidst the chaos, Mark, Jenny's best friend, noticed her absence. Panic rising, he remembered Jenny mentioning her plan to check the bathrooms. Without a second thought, he rushed out of the gym, heading towards the bathrooms. The hallways were nearly deserted now, the fog outside casting a surreal glow through the windows. As Mark neared the bathroom, the temperature dropped sharply, his breath visible in the air. He heard a faint scream, Jenny's voice. He was sure of it, and he sprinted the final stretch. Reaching the bathroom, he found the door slightly ajar, the inside dark and quiet, too quiet. "Jenny," he called out, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. There was no response, only the sound of dripping water somewhere in the shadows. He pushed the door fully open, his phone's flashlight piercing the darkness, revealing the devastation inside. Tiles and debris were scattered everywhere, and the stall door was indeed shut. Approaching cautiously, he reached out, hesitating for a moment before flinging it open. It revealed nothing but the remnants of the floor, now a gaping hole. Peering into the abyss, Mark felt a dizzying sense of vertigo as the edges seemed to undulate, whispering voices beckoning him closer. Steeling himself, he shouted into the void, "Jenny, are you down there?" His voice was swallowed by the darkness, the echoes distorted as if mocking him. Behind him, the corridor was filling with more students, drawn by curiosity and the alarm raised by his rushed exit from the gym. They crowded at the door, peering over his shoulder into the eerie scene. Suddenly, a low, rumbling growl emanated from the hole, silencing the whispers and causing the onlookers to step back in fear. The ground shook, and a cold wind blasted out from the depths, carrying with it a pungent, earthy smell. From within the dark, something moved, a shadow at first, then taking a more definite form. It was a figure, crawling slowly up from the darkness, its features obscured, its movements jerky and unnatural. As the figure emerged into the dim light of the bathroom, it became clear it was not Jenny. The creature, for it could only be described as such, was humanoid but grotesque, its skin pallid and wet, eyes hollow and unseeing. It paused, as if disoriented, then turned its head towards Mark and the others, opening its mouth to reveal a gaping maw lined with sharp, jagged teeth. The students recoiled in horror, some screaming, others frozen in place. Mark, heart pounding, backed away slowly, his mind racing. He needed to find Jenny, but first, he had to get everyone to safety. He shouted for the students to run, to get out of the building, his voice barely audible over the sounds of the creature's growls and the renewed whispers echoing from the void. As chaos erupted, with students scrambling in every direction, Mark took one last look into the hole, hoping for a sign of Jenny. Instead, he saw multiple pairs of gleaming eyes beginning to ascend from the darkness, and he knew then that the nightmare had only just begun. Mark, amidst the chaos, made a split-second decision. He grabbed a piece of broken tile from the floor and hurled it at the creature, hitting it squarely in the head. The creature staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it let out an anguished howl that seemed to shake the very walls of the bathroom. The sound was so terrifying that it momentarily halted the students in their tracks, their instincts torn between flight and the paralyzing fear that rooted them to the spot. Mark used the creature's momentary disorientation to his advantage, shouting at the students again, "Move! Get out of here!" This time, his command cut through their fear, and they stumbled away, racing down the corridor towards the emergency exits. Mark followed, making sure no one was left behind, but as he reached the hallway, he glanced back towards the bathroom. The creature was advancing, more of its kind appearing from the depths, their eyes glowing with a hungry light. As they approached the main entrance, another tremor rocked the building, stronger than before. Cracks spread across the walls and ceiling, debris falling around them. It was clear the school itself was succumbing to whatever malevolent force had been unleashed. Outside, the fog had thickened into an almost impenetrable wall. Mark and the other students emerged into it, coughing and squinting, trying to make out their surroundings. The school bus was nearby, abandoned by the driver in the chaos. Mark directed the students towards it. "Get on the bus. We need to get as far away from here as possible," he instructed. Once he was sure all the students who had followed him were aboard, Mark turned to the driver's seat, intending to drive the bus himself. As he placed his hand on the door, a chilling realization stopped him cold. Jenny was still inside the school. His heart raced as he weighed his responsibility towards the frightened students on the bus against the need to save his best friend. Determined, Mark made a decision. He turned to Sarah, a fellow senior known for her level-headedness, and handed her the keys. "Get them to safety. Call for help as soon as you're clear of this place. I have to go back for Jenny." Without waiting for a response, he turned and ran back towards the school, the screams of the creatures echoing behind him as if in pursuit. Entering the building once more, he headed straight for the bathroom. The ground continued to shake, and with each tremor, Mark felt as if the school was sinking deeper into an abyss. Reaching the bathroom, he found the hole now larger, the edges crumbling away. The creatures were no longer there, they had spread into the school, their roars and growls a horrifying chorus that filled the hallways. Mark peered into the void, calling for Jenny with a desperation that choked his voice. Suddenly, from deep within the darkness, a faint voice called back. "Mark!" It was Jenny. Relief flooded through him, followed quickly by renewed fear for her safety. "Hold on, Jenny! I'm coming!" Mark shouted. He looked around for something to use to descend into the void safely, but found nothing. The building moaned ominously, warning him of its impending collapse. Mark took a deep breath, his decision made. He was going to save Jenny, no matter what. He swung his legs over the edge and began to lower himself into the darkness, his hands finding precarious holds on the jagged edges of the hole. As he descended, the sounds from above grew fainter, replaced by the whispers and cries from below, calling to him, tempting him, threatening him. But Mark's focus was clear. He was going to bring Jenny back, or they would both be lost to the darkness forever. As Mark descended further into the abyss, the air grew colder and the darkness enveloped him, thick and suffocating. The whispers became louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to claw at his mind, trying to instill fear and doubt. He gritted his teeth and pressed on, his hands searching the rough walls for holds, his feet dangling into the unknown. Above him, the faint sounds of the school continued to deteriorate, the groans of the building's agony barely reaching his ears. Below, an eerie glow began to emanate, casting a faint light in the darkness. It wasn't comforting, it was a sickly green, shimmering off the walls and creating grotesque shadows. "Jenny!" Mark called out again, his voice echoing against the stone. This time, her reply was closer, more urgent. "Mark! Be careful!" He paused, listening intently. The voices around him twisted her words, mimicking her voice in a mocking tone, but he pushed their taunts aside. His feet finally touched ground, a solid, albeit uneven, surface that seemed to be made of the same stone as the walls. The green light was stronger here, emanating from a series of cracks in the earth that formed a network across the cavern floor. Mark squinted in the dim light, trying to locate Jenny. There, to his right, he saw movement, a figure huddled against the wall, her arms wrapped around her knees. Jenny, he rushed over, his relief immense when he saw it was indeed her, though she looked pale and frightened. Mark, you shouldn't have come, she whispered, her voice trembling. It's too dangerous. They want to keep us here, forever. We're getting out of here, together, Mark asserted, helping her to her feet. As they prepared to make their way back, a low rumble filled the cavern, the green light pulsating like the heartbeat of the abyss itself. The ground shook violently, throwing them off balance. From the cracks, more creatures began to emerge, their forms more terrifying than the ones above, misshapen, their limbs twisted, their eyes glowing with that same eerie green light. They moved towards Mark and Jenny, their intentions clear. Mark grabbed a large rock from the ground, using it to fend off the nearest creature. Jenny found a sharp-edged stone and did the same. Together, they fought, slowly making their way towards the wall they had descended. But with each step, more creatures emerged, relentless and seemingly unending. We need another way out, Jenny panted, ducking as a creature lunged at her. Mark scanned the cavern, noticing for the first time that the network of cracks seemed to converge towards a singular point on the far side of the cavern. There, the light was brightest, and the air seemed to ripple as if heated by an invisible fire. There, he pointed. We make for that point. It might be another exit. Dodging and weaving through the creatures, they made their way towards the light. The ground continued to shake, and parts of the ceiling began to crumble, dust and debris falling around them. It was a perilous journey, each step fraught with danger, but the potential escape fueled their desperate hope. As they reached the center of the light, the ground beneath them felt different, warmer and smoother. The light pulsed stronger, and a gust of wind rose from the cracks, carrying whispers not of threat, but of ancient sadness and longing. The creatures hesitated, stopping at the edge of the light, their forms flickering as if unable to enter. Quick, this way! Mark urged, pulling Jenny into the center of the light. As they stepped forward, the ground beneath them shifted, opening up to reveal a ladder leading down into yet another level of darkness. But this time, there was a promise of an end, a faint hint of fresh air wafting from below. Without hesitation, they climbed down, the light fading above them, sealing them in with a new layer of darkness as they descended into the unknown depths, their fate uncertain, their resolve unbroken. Descending the ladder into the deeper darkness, Mark and Jenny felt the air change around them, growing colder yet somehow fresher with each rung they passed. The faint hint of fresh air became stronger, more tangible, as if it was leading them towards a possible escape. The narrow vertical tunnel they were navigating seemed ancient, the walls rough and moist to the touch, lined with a strange sort of moss that glowed faintly, providing a minimal light source. The ladder ended abruptly, and they dropped down onto a damp, rocky floor. This new level was different from the cavern above. It was a natural tunnel, the walls curving inward, forming a sort of underground passage. The air here was tinged with the smell of the ocean, salty and wet, suggesting that they might be beneath the coastal cliffs near their town. Can you hear that? Jenny whispered, pausing to listen. The distant sound of waves crashing against rocks reached their ears, a sound both heartening and haunting in their current predicament. Mark nodded, his voice filled with renewed hope. The sea. We must be under the cliffside. If we follow the sound, it might lead us out. With Jenny close behind, Mark led the way, their progress slow as they navigated the slippery rocks and sudden dips in the floor. Every now and then, they would stop, listening for the sound of the sea, using it as their guide through the darkness. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, they began to notice remnants of old, rusted metal tracks embedded in the ground, and broken wooden beams scattered around. Looks like an old smuggling tunnel, Mark surmised, recalling stories of smugglers in the area centuries ago. The tunnel began to slope downward, and the sound of the sea grew louder, more pronounced. It was a comforting sound, one that spoke of the outside world, of freedom. But with it came a new sound, a soft, melodic humming, echoing through the tunnel. The tune was unfamiliar, hauntingly beautiful, yet it sent shivers down their spines. "Where is that coming from?" Jenny asked, her voice tense. Mark shook his head, unable to determine its source. "I don't know, but let's keep moving. We're close, I can feel it." They continued, the humming growing louder as they approached what looked like a fork in the tunnel. One path veered off towards the louder sound of the waves, while the other descended further into darkness, the humming emanating strongly from that direction. Mark paused, torn. The logical choice was to follow the sound of the waves, but something about the humming intrigued him, pulling at him almost hypnotically. He looked at Jenny, seeing the same conflict reflected in her eyes. "We should split up," Jenny suggested hesitantly. "I'll follow the waves. You take the humming path. We'll cover more ground." Mark knew it was logical, but the idea of separating filled him with dread. Yet, before he could protest, Jenny was moving down the tunnel towards the sound of the sea, her figure quickly swallowed up by the darkness. Left alone, Mark turned towards the path from where the humming came. As he walked, the air grew warmer, the humming louder, more compelling. It seemed to be calling to him, a siren song in the depths of the earth. The path led to a small chamber, the center of which glowed with an ethereal light. In the middle of the light, a figure danced gracefully, its movements fluid and mesmerizing. Mark stood transfixed, unable to move, his mind caught between the desire to approach and the instinct to flee. As he watched, the figure stopped dancing and turned towards him, its eyes glowing with the same eerie light. A smile spread across its face, welcoming yet unnerving. "Welcome, traveler," the figure spoke, its voice echoing the melodic tune. "You have come far, but the journey is not yet over." Mark felt a chill run through him as the figure stepped closer, the room around him beginning to spin, the walls blurring into streaks of light and shadow. As the walls spun, Mark's head swam with vertigo, his senses overwhelmed by the blending of light and shadow. The figure before him, now clearer in the ethereal glow, seemed almost otherworldly, its features both beautiful and terrifying. "Who are you?" Mark managed to ask, his voice barely a whisper against the hum that filled the chamber. The figure smiled, its face shifting subtly as if made of water, ever-changing and fluid. "I am the keeper of paths, the guide for lost souls. You have wandered far from your world, traveler. What seeks you in the depths of forgotten ways?" Mark, trying to steady his spinning head, focused on the figure's question. "I'm trying to find my way out, to save my friend and myself from whatever is happening in the school above." The figure nodded, the hum intensifying around them. "The paths you choose lead to more than mere escape. They are entwined with your fate, and the choices you make here ripple across realities." Mark felt the weight of the figure's words, a sense of destiny pressing upon him. "How do I choose the right path?" "Listen to the voices of the ancient tunnels," the figure advised. "Follow the song that resonates with your heart. But beware, for some songs are meant to lead astray." As the humming subsided slightly, Mark listened intently. There were now multiple tunes, each emanating from various tunnels that branched off from the chamber. One tune, deep and resonant, seemed familiar, pulling at him with a sense of urgency and warmth. Another was the haunting melody that had led him here, filled with beauty but now tinged with a coldness that made him shiver. Deciding to trust his instincts, Mark chose the path of the deep, resonant tune. He glanced back at the figure, seeking confirmation. "Is this the way?" The figure's smile deepened, a mysterious glint in its eyes. "All paths are the way, and none are. The journey is yours to walk, and the end is yours to discover." With a nod, Mark turned and followed the tunnel from which the deep tune flowed. As he walked, the light from the chamber faded, and he was enveloped once again in darkness, with only the glow of the moss on the walls to guide him. The tune became clearer, a melody of depth that seemed to vibrate through the ground under his feet. Meanwhile, Jenny, following the sound of crashing waves, found her path sloping steeply downwards. The air grew misty, the salt smell stronger now, promising proximity to the sea. The tunnel ended abruptly at a large cavern whose walls were partially open to the ocean. The waves crashed against the rocks below, spray reaching up to where Jenny stood. She searched the cavern for any sign of an exit that would lead up to the cliffs above. Among the rocks, she noticed a rope ladder, old and worn, dangling from a higher ledge. As she approached it, she heard a soft, mournful wail from above, like the wind singing through the cavern. Looking up, she saw nothing but the dark outline of the cliffs against the starry sky. Jenny grasped the ladder, testing its strength before beginning her ascent. Each step was precarious, the ladder swaying with the force of the wind and the spray of the waves. Above her, the mournful wail continued, now mixed with what sounded like a voice calling her name, lost in the howling of the wind. As Mark delved deeper into his chosen tunnel and Jenny climbed toward the cliff top, both felt a deepening connection to their paths, unaware of how closely their fates were intertwined with the ancient, whispering tunnels and the mysterious forces at play in the depths of the earth. As Mark followed the deep, resonant tune through the twisting tunnel, each step seemed to lead him deeper into the heart of the earth. The hum vibrated through the stone, aligning with his own heartbeat, a rhythm that seemed both foreign and familiar. Gradually, the tunnel widened into a vast underground hall, its ceiling lost in shadows. At the center of the hall, a pool of water reflected the faint, glowing moss. The tune emanated from the pool, its depths murky yet strangely inviting. Meanwhile, Jenny's climb was fraught with danger. The rope ladder creaked ominously with each gust of wind, but she persevered, driven by the voice that seemed to call out to her from above. Finally, reaching the cliff top, she collapsed onto the grass, breathing heavily, the sea's roar below now just a distant rumble. The voice had guided her here, and as she looked around, she noticed an old, weather-beaten path leading away from the cliff and back towards the town. The voice, now clearer, urged her on, "This way, come home." Back in the underground hall, Mark approached the pool, drawn by the melody. As he neared, the water stirred, and from its depths rose a figure, not menacing but solemn, an ancient being clad in robes that seemed woven from the very darkness of the cave. "You have followed the true tune," it spoke, its voice echoing the hum. "But the path home is not yet clear. You must take from here the stone of choosing." It extended its hand, revealing a small, luminescent stone, pulsing with light. Mark took the stone hesitantly, feeling its power surge through him, a power that connected him to the earth and the paths he had walked. "What must I do with this?" he asked. "To end the nightmare, you must reunite this stone with its counterpart, held by another who walks a path parallel to yours," the figure instructed. As it spoke, an image of Jenny flashed across the surface of the water, showing her standing on the cliff's edge, the wind in her hair, looking towards home. Understanding dawned on Mark. "Jenny," he whispered. He thanked the ancient being and rushed back through the tunnel, the stone's glow lighting his way, its pull now directing him towards Jenny. Jenny, following the old path, found herself inexplicably walking towards the school. As she approached, she saw Mark emerging from the forest, running towards her. They met in front of the school, the site of their nightmare, both out of breath but relieved. Mark showed her the stone, and Jenny instinctively reached into her pocket, pulling out a matching stone she didn't remember taking but felt she had always carried. As they held the stones together, the two stones pulsed with light, and a wave of energy washed over the school. The fog lifted, the darkness receded, and the oppressive feeling that had haunted the halls was gone. "We did it," Mark said, hardly believing. Jenny nodded, a smile breaking through her exhaustion. "Let's go home." As they walked away from the school, the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting light on the new path they would now forge together, free from the shadows that had chased them through the night. Their nightmare had ended, but their journey, marked by courage and bound by a newfound strength, was just beginning.